Welcome to the C Analysis podcast. I'm your host, Chaz Nuttycombe, the director of C Analysis. Today, I'm joined by Laura. Is it pronounced Belin?
Belin.
Belin. She is the head of Bleeding Heartland. It's a blog that is dedicated to Iowa politics with a progressive lean to it. And today, we're going to be talking about redistricting in Iowa. And how it's different from redistricting from 10 years ago, the scheduling of it, et cetera, et cetera. Laura, thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So let's get right into it. Technically, so Iowa has a gold standard redistricting commission, I would say. I think they have the best redistricting commission in the country when it comes to giving fair, proportional maps that combine communities of interest, doesn't split localities too much, and takes into account partisan fairness. But the GOP technically can override what the commission draws. They can say, we're not going to use your map. But before we started recording, you were talking a little bit about this, about how they're on a tight deadline that may not be possible for the legislative maps. Can you talk a little bit about the commission's timeline and how the GOP can override the maps and what happens if they don't get to that deadline?
Sure. Iowa does. I would say we do have a gold standard redistricting system. There's with a little bit of a ticking time bomb in it, which I'll get to in a moment. So we've had this redistricting process in place since the 1981 cycle. And the way it works is we have a very highly respected nonpartisan agency called the Legislative Services Agency. They get together, they have experts, and in fact, several of their experts have now worked on 3 or 4 redistricting cycles in Iowa, so they're very familiar with it. They draw a set of maps, congressional and legislative maps, and they have to follow standards of population equality, compactness, contiguity, and there are certain things that they cannot take into account, like incumbents' addresses and partisan voting of the district and so on. So it's a really fair system for creating a fair map. Now, in a normal year, what happens is the Legislative Services Agency gets the population data from the Census Bureau by sometime in February, and they spend about 4 to 6 weeks putting together a first map. They're supposed to have a proposal to the legislature by April 1st. And so, for example, in 2011, they released the plan on March 31st, and the whole thing was signed into law already by April 20th because the legislature adopted the first set of maps. But if the legislature votes down the first proposed map or the legislature passes it and the governor vetoes it, then the Legislative Services Agency has 35 days, I think, to draw up a second set of maps that has to still follow all the same standards. And that will be presented to the legislature. And again, I forgot to say, the legislature can only vote up or down on the first map and the second map. They can't amend that. If the second map gets rejected, the Legislative Services Agency has another 30, 35 days to produce a third map. The third map can be amended. And so this is where, with the Republican trifecta, Democrats have been worried about this for some time, that Republicans could just vote down the first 2 maps and then amend the third to a gerrymander, and then the governor would sign it into law. The problem is that this year, for them anyway, it's not a problem from my perspective, but the census data is so late, as I'm sure you've discussed on your podcast before. So the LSA is not even going to get the data until sometime in mid-August. And then we don't know. I mean, it could be that it won't take them as long as it usually does to create a map. But I mean, I would say at minimum a few days to come up with a proposed set of congressional and legislative maps. And so the legislature, even if they act really quickly, call a special session, vote down the first set of maps in late August, it's just going to be really tight for the LSA to come up with another plan and another plan, because our state constitution says that by September 1st, the legislature is supposed to adopt new legislative districts, and the governor is supposed to have signed that into law by September 15th. And if that doesn't happen, the Iowa Supreme Court takes over the process. Now, this has never happened in the history of Iowa. And a law scholar told me that the reason why they put this in there in the 1850s was they didn't want a situation where the legislative incumbent said, well, we just like the districts the way they are, and we think that maybe this decade we won't draw a new map. So they wanted something to be in there just to make sure that the legislature would have to adopt a new map. But they weren't thinking about the situation where like the census data wouldn't even be in the state until August. And so it's a very unusual situation. And the Iowa Supreme Court has been really cryptic about how they might handle this. They issued a statement in April that was a little bit hard to read. They said that they like the current nonpartisan process, but they didn't exactly commit to, would they allow the legislature to vote on a plan, or would they consult with legislative leaders? We don't really know how that would work. So, and I just want to add one more complicating factor, which is that the constitutional deadline only applies to legislative districts, not congressional districts, not mentioned in the Constitution. Now, typically, the Legislative Services Agency, they come up with a congressional map first, and then they work down from there to the Iowa House and Senate districts, because in the state code, it says that as much as possible, state legislative districts shall be contained within the same congressional district. So they don't want to have a situation where they have legislative districts that straddle more than one congressional district. So they've always done those sets of maps in tandem. But theoretically, it could happen this year that the Iowa Supreme Court could take over the legislative redistricting after September 15th. And the Iowa House and Senate could say, well, we still want to vote on congressional maps. So it's not really clear how that would work. Our state constitution says counties can't be divided in congressional districts. So there is a little bit of a constraint there. But then, if there's a nonpartisan legislative map, but a partisan congressional map, it's not really clear how that would work.
Well, the Iowa Supreme Court, remind me, is it mostly liberal appointees or conservative?
Right now, 6 of the justices were appointed by Republicans and 1 by a Democrat. And so that's a bit concerning for people. Now, one person who I've talked with quite a bit over the last couple of years about this is named Daryl Hansen. He used to serve in the Iowa House as a Republican, and he was very active in the 1981 and the 1991 redistricting. And whenever I've sounded the alarm about this possibility of the Republicans amending the third map to a gerrymander, he's always told me this would not be as easy as you think, because there is an Iowa Supreme Court ruling from 1972 that actually predates the system we have now, but it was related to redistricting. And it says that if you override the nonpartisan map, you have to be able to show that your map is superior in some way to the nonpartisan map you rejected. So they would have to have either better population equality or more compactness. And this is all defined in Iowa code. So the question is, could they amend the map to a gerrymander and still be able to demonstrate, because it would be challenged in court, certainly, could they demonstrate that it's better than the nonpartisan map? And my question is, I don't really think that this current Iowa Supreme Court would feel bound by that 1972 precedent at all. I mean, there have been a number of cases, including one just a few weeks ago related to a restriction on Planned Parenthood funding, where this Iowa Supreme Court seems very inclined to say, the legislature can do whatever it wants, really. I mean, within reason. I find it unlikely that if the legislature changed the maps, that this Iowa Supreme Court would say, no, we don't want to let you do that. Now, I don't think the Supreme Court justices themselves would be party to a gerrymander. I mean, if it gets past September 15th and we don't have a map and the Supreme Court takes over the process, I don't think they're going to just let Republicans draw a gerrymandered map. But I mean, if they adopt a set of legislative maps and then the state house Republicans try to adopt a gerrymandered congressional map, I think it might be, it would certainly be challenged in court. And I hesitate to predict how it would go. I mean, there are some people who would tell you, that they wouldn't succeed with that gerrymander because of this 1972 Iowa Supreme Court precedent. And I'm just not so sure.
Is there a scenario where, let's say the Supreme Court takes up the reins, to where they appoint a special master then?
Well, they would probably, they haven't said, they've said that they like the process, the way it works. They want to stick as closely as possible to the process outlined in Iowa code. So I think that means that they would direct the Legislative Services Agency to go ahead and produce a nonpartisan map. Now, I'm not sure, let's say that the LSA presents a map, the Iowa legislature doesn't like it. They have a special session in late August. They vote it down, but they don't get another map adopted in time. I don't really think the Iowa Supreme Court would necessarily approve the map that was rejected by the legislature, although they could. I don't think there's any really limit. It just says the Constitution language is very simple. It says that the Supreme Court shall cause districts to be drawn. And of course, the constitutional language is way before we had a legislative services agency. But I think that what they would do is they would direct these same experts with the LSA to come up with some kind of nonpartisan plan. And that's what they would adopt, at least for legislative districts. I don't think that they could adopt a congressional map. But again, it's a little bit confusing because usually the LSA maps do come as a package deal. They start with the congressional map, and then they work down to make sure that all of the House and Senate districts, as much as possible, are contained within those congressional districts. So this deadline makes things really complicated for Republicans. It would be a lot easier for them if we had the population data already in the spring or late winter, which is on the usual timetable. They would have a much freer hand.
And did you say the deadline was September 1st or the 15th?
Well, it says that the legislature shall vote on the maps by the 1st, but then they have to be enacted into law by the 15th. So I guess they wanted to give the governor some time to weigh in. So in theory, it has to be signed into law by the 15th. And I think that if the legislature, I mean, if they got a plan and they voted on it after September 1st, but as long as it was signed into law by the 15th, I mean, I'm sure somebody might challenge it, but it seems like as long as it seems like the more important deadline is a new map has to be signed into law by September 15th. And again, this was something originally designed just to make sure that the incumbents didn't sit there and refuse to redistrict. So the Iowa Supreme Court, I know there have been some state Supreme Courts. I think California was one where they extended the deadline, but the Iowa Supreme Court hasn't said anything about extending that constitutional deadline. So I think that they, would try to follow the process. I think that they don't want to get mixed up in a big partisan mess. I mean, I think that even though they're conservative justices, I don't think that they want to be seen to be serving the Republican leaders of the legislature. And the Republican lawmakers also maybe don't want to be seen as in opposition to the court. I mean, it's possible if the first map that they get before September 1st is not that objectionable to them, they might just go ahead and pass it just to be done with it and not have the court take over. And a lot of Republicans are very confident right now, and maybe with good reason, that they can keep legislative majorities even with a fair map. So why do they need to gerrymander the map?
Right. And I would absolutely agree with that. I do not think that either legislative chamber in Iowa is going to be competitive in 2022, even under a fair map. Mm-hmm. I don't think so at all.
I mean, Democrats should be able to pick up some seats with a fair map, especially in the House.
Possibly. Yeah, possibly.
But a 59-41 split, which is where we are now. I mean, that's pretty tough to get a net gain of 10 seats.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there might be a case to where they may be able to pick up seats under a fair map, given the population shifts. Mm-hmm. But regardless, I think there is a ceiling of 40 some seats for them under a fair map. Now, when it comes to, so they pretty much have 2 weeks to draw this map, the commission. Mm-hmm. But usually it does take 4 to 6 weeks. Let's do say the scenario where they get it done in a few days. And let's say the Republicans vote it down. Do you think, they voted down enough times to where, they're like, okay, let's draw our own map. Do you think they'd have enough time to actually get their own map and vote on them by September 1st?
I don't think they would. I was just talking with someone about this a couple of days ago. And I realize now that I left out one step in the process. There is something called the Temporary Redistricting Advisory Commission that doesn't draw the maps, but they organize a series of at least 3 public hearings once the map is made public. And so usually this happens over the course of a week, and it happens very quickly. So it's a bipartisan commission. So in 2011, like I said, the map was released on March 31st. Before April 10th, they held this redistricting advisory commission held 3 meetings in different congressional districts, and then they submitted their recommendation to the legislature to pass the map. And then the Iowa House and Senate voted through the maps, and the governor signed it. So they have to leave at least a few days for this advisory commission to hold public hearings as well. And those don't take a long time. But I mean, again, that's something where the LSA doesn't release a map and then the legislature votes on it the next day. They have to, under the code, they have to go through this process. And usually it's not an issue because we've never been under this kind of time crunch before. So I do not think they would have time. And now somebody was telling me with the computer programs they have now, it wouldn't take them weeks. They probably,
Oh yeah.
they can have 2 or 3 plans that conform to whatever the Iowa code says about population equality and compactness, so that if they present a plan and the legislature votes it down, they might be able to present plan B, just even a couple of days later. So that's possible. But again, then you still have to have the redistricting commission still has to hold its public hearings. And I just don't think there's any way they can get to that third map before September 1st or even before September 15th. I just think that would be very difficult to happen. And they would have to call more than one special legislative session, and it would look bad to do that. So, I mean, they would have to be, for them to take that route, they would have to really, really not like the nonpartisan map.
And so you're saying how the Supreme Court likes the current fair process under the commission. So if they do not meet these deadlines and the court does have to take over, do you think they would just pretty much grant an extension for the commission to do its job?
I think they would. I mean, they're, like I said, the statement that they released in April was really not that helpful. They said, well, this isn't, we've been asked, a lot of people have been asking us how we're going to handle this. And so, these are some guidelines that may inform our approach. But it sounded like, as much as possible, they want to follow the process in Iowa code. And I mean, most people read that to mean they want the LSA to draw a fair map. They want a nonpartisan map. But what's not clear, and of course, everybody was asking them, does that mean you're going to let the legislature vote on the maps, even if it's after September 15th? And they did not clarify one way or the other. The legislative leaders, the House Speaker and the Senate Majority Leader, I don't know whether they had private assurances or whether they were just trying to work the refs or, spin the system, but they were like, oh, this is good. We're going to be able to vote on maps. It definitely, the statement did not say the legislature is going to have an opportunity to vote on these maps, but the Republican leadership seems to think or project the idea that they think that they will get a chance to vote on it. So I don't know how that would work. I do think, like I said, this Supreme Court, it's clear that they don't want to be party to a gerrymander. They want some kind of nonpartisan map to emerge from this whole process. But that, again, they only have a say over the legislative maps. And my big question mark is what happens to this congressional map if we're after September 15th. Now, another thing I should have mentioned, and this is something I've consistently heard from people in both parties who've been involved with the legislature redistricting, is that, like, while people like you are often, well, you have this particular interest in state legislature, so you might be an exception, but most national forecasters are more interested in the congressional maps. But of course, the state lawmakers are interested in their own maps much more than the congressional districts. And I've heard stories from after the 1981, 1991 maps came out where members of Congress, or like Senator Tom Harkin, didn't like, when he was still in Congress, that he didn't like the proposal that they came up with in 1981, but that even like the Democratic legislators, they don't really care about what the congressional map looks like as much as, do we think we can hold a majority in the House and the Senate under this map? So that, so if the legislators end up in this situation where they have an opportunity to gerrymander a congressional map, I mean, I'm not saying that they wouldn't take that, but what they'd really like is to be able to draw their own Iowa House and Senate maps.
Yeah. So when it comes to population shifts, let's say there is the best case scenario for Democrats, which is the gold standard commission gets to draw these maps, rather than seeing a Republican gerrymander come in place. So when it comes to population shifts, let me give you an example. Loudoun County, for home state example, Loudoun County, Virginia, has had its population explode. It's up in Northern Virginia. It's the wealthiest county in the country, and it's just had an enormous population explosion. So under a fair map here in Virginia and the House of Delegates, there'd be an entirely new seat, entirely new, moved into Loudoun County in the eastern part, because it's just had a population boom. Is there anything like that in the metropolitan areas in Iowa, in the lower chambers, somewhere like Des Moines?
Mm-hmm. Yes. I mean, Iowa has 99 counties and only 8 or 9 of them are gaining in population. And that's been the case for decades. I mean, there's been a long-standing trend of population flowing out of the rural areas into the urban and suburban counties. And the problem for Democrats is that they're still, even with a fair map, there probably wouldn't be enough urban and suburban seats to get to majorities in the chambers. But that's why, as we were talking before, I do think that under a fair map, Democrats should certainly have opportunities to gain at least a few Iowa House seats and maybe 1 or 2 Iowa Senate seats. One real complication for them is that, so Polk County is the Des Moines area, that's the largest in the state, and that's grown quite a bit. Dallas County, which is the far western suburbs of Des Moines, that's had explosive growth as well. Come on, I'm sorry. The Cedar Rapids metro has grown a little, but Johnson County, which is where Iowa City and the University of Iowa is, it's the most Democratic county in Iowa. It's grown a lot, and really it should have an additional Iowa House seat. But the problem is the census is based on where you were on April 1st, 2020. And of course, the universities had sent everyone home because of the pandemic. So tens of thousands of University of Iowa students were not on campus on April 1st, 2020. In a normal year, they would have been there and their bodies would have counted. So that, and to a lesser extent in the Ames area, which is where Iowa State University is, that could really disadvantage them from a redistricting perspective, because an additional Iowa House seat in Johnson County is one that Democrats would win easily. But
Yeah.
if all of those University of Iowa students are counted where they live with their parents, and many of them not even in the state of Iowa, then that is going to hurt Democratic opportunities. But I still do think should be at least another couple of Iowa House seats in the suburbs of Des Moines, should be a new Iowa Senate seat or 2 there, should be in the Cedar Rapids metro area. And it's really not that many metro areas in Iowa that are growing. So a fair map would benefit Democrats. I mean, the biggest problem Democrats in Iowa have is that we have a lot of medium-sized cities, so cities between 15 and 40,000 population, so smaller cities. And a lot of those places used to be Democratic strongholds, but they're not anymore. And so that's where Democrats struggle to get to majorities, because we don't hold the Iowa House and Senate seats anymore in places like Fort Dodge and Ottumwa and Clinton, Muscatine, Burlington, some of them, Marshalltown, Iffy. So that is where Mason City is going to be probably in danger in the next cycle. So that's where it gets hard. But a fair map, definitely, there's been enough growth in the larger metros of Iowa that should add a few Democratic seats under a fair map scenario.
All right. Laura, thank you so much for coming on. If y'all want to check out her work, you can go to bleedingheartland.com, right?
Correct. bleedingheartland.com. And I am on Twitter at Laura R. Belin. So middle initial R is important.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on.
All right. Thanks.